On a grim, grey winter morning, a massive crowd presses into Belém Square in Lisbon. They are gathered in anxious anticipation of a macabre spectacle that is about to begin. The date is January 13, 1759, and the people of Portugal are about to witness the most cruel execution in their nation's history. The systematic annihilation of the kingdom's most powerful noble family, the Távoras. The first to ascend the scaffold is the 60-year-old matriarch, Marchioness Leonor, head of Portugal's most ancient dynasty. Before her, the executioners methodically display their instruments of torture, sadistically describing in detail the agonies her husband, sons, and son-in-law will endure in the coming hours. She begs for a quick end. A single, clean strike of an axe decapitates the woman who once commanded royal courts. This is only the first act of a tragedy that will last the entire day. But how did we arrive at this moment of unparalleled horror in Portuguese history? To understand the massacre of the Távoras, we must go back several months, to a fateful night that would forever change the destiny of Portugal. The date is September 3, 1758. Around 11 o'clock at night, King Joseph I is returning to the Ajuda Palace in a plain, unmarked carriage after one of his clandestine romantic encounters. The 44-year-old monarch was involved in a scandalous affair with Teresa de Távora e Lorena, the wife of the 4th Marquis of Távora, and a woman 35 years younger than his own mother-in-law. As the royal carriage passes the site where the Memoria Church stands today, 3 horsemen emerge from the shadows. The sound of musket fire shatters the Lisbon night. King Joseph is struck in the right arm and hip, but he survives the assassination attempt. Wounded but lucid, the king immediately commands his most powerful minister to find and punish those responsible in an exemplary fashion. That minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the future Marquis of Pombal, receives the royal decree with a malicious satisfaction. The attack presents him with a perfect opportunity to eliminate his most dangerous political rivals, the traditional high nobility who opposed his agenda of centralizing royal power. Pombal knew precisely where to aim his cannons of vengeance. The Távora family represented everything Pombal despised about Old Portugal. As descendants of medieval crusaders, the Távoras had amassed immense power, land, and titles over centuries of service to the crown. They were one of the oldest and most prestigious houses in the realm, connected by marriage to the powerful families of Aveiro, Cadaval, and others. Their patriarch, Dom Francisco de Assis, the 3rd Marquis of Távora, had served as the Viceroy of India and was a respected military commander. Crucially, the Távoras were declared enemies of Pombal, whom they viewed as an upstart lacking the proper breeding for his high office. The family's matriarch, Marchioness Leonor, was a devout Catholic with strong ties to the Jesuits, a religious order that Pombal saw as an obstacle to absolute royal authority. The animosity was mutual and explosive. The scandalous relationship between King Joseph and Teresa de Távora only added fuel to this fire. Everyone in the Portuguese court knew the king met regularly with the young Marchioness, publicly humiliating her husband. This intolerable situation fueled the Távoras' resentment toward a monarch they considered debauched and unworthy. Pombal masterfully wove these volatile elements into his narrative of conspiracy. Throughout December of 1758, he ordered the arrest of hundreds of suspected nobles. The total number of prisoners swelled to over 1,000 people, the vast majority of whom would never receive a formal trial. It was a political purge disguised as a criminal investigation. The methods Pombal employed were brutal, even for the standards of the era. Members of the Távora family were subjected to systematic torture to extract confessions. Even the prosecution's own witnesses were tortured to ensure their testimonies aligned with the official version of events. Truth became irrelevant. Only Pombal's political narrative mattered. For weeks, the interrogations continued in the dungeons of Lisbon. Dom Francisco de Assis, a man of 65, was broken physically and psychologically by his tormentors. His sons, 22-year-old José Maria and Luis Bernardo, suffered similar tortures. The Duke of Aveiro, whom Pombal identified as the leader of the supposed conspiracy, was treated with exceptional brutality by the inquisitors. On January 12, 1759, The verdict was delivered. All the defendants were found guilty of high treason, rebellion, and parricide, the latter because the king was considered the father of the nation. The sentence ordered their immediate public execution, the total confiscation of their property, and the permanent revocation of their noble titles. Pombal organized the executions as a meticulously planned political spectacle. Illustrated pamphlets detailing the tortures were printed and distributed throughout the city, designed to fill every citizen with horror. A special scaffold was built in Belém, near the site of the famous pastry house. The location was symbolic. Belém represented the maritime power the Távoras had helped to build. On the morning of January 13th, crowds flocked to witness the event. Pombal intended for the execution to serve as a definitive warning to any noble who dared challenge the centralized power of the king. The first to be brought to the scaffold was Marchioness Leonor. At 60 years old, she maintained her royal dignity even in the face of imminent death. The executioners forced her to observe the instruments of torture prepared for her family: wheels to break bones, pincers to tear flesh, and ropes for strangulation. They described how her husband and sons would die. After her plea for a swift death, the executioner's axe fell, and her head rolled across the scaffold. The crowd roared. It was the first noble blood spilled, but it was only the beginning. Next came José Maria de Távora, the family's youngest son. At 22, he was a handsome young man, representing the future generation of the Portuguese nobility. He was stretched and tied to a large wooden X-shaped cross. The executioners then systematically broke the bones in his arms and legs with heavy iron mallets. Afterward, they began to strangle him, but the ropes snapped, leaving the young nobleman to agonize for long minutes before he finally died. He was followed by his brother Luis Bernardo, the fourth Marquis of Távora and the husband of the king's mistress, Teresa. In a cruel twist of irony, the man whose wife slept with the king was executed for alleged crimes against that very same monarch. He endured the identical torture. His bones were shattered on the wheel before the final strangulation. The patriarch, Dom Francisco de Assis, could barely drag himself to the platform, broken by months of torture in prison. The former Viceroy of India, once a formidable commander, was now a shattered man awaiting a painful death. His bones too were smashed on the wheel before he was strangled. The Duke of Aveiro, José Mascarenhas, was subjected to a special humiliation. In addition to the standard physical torture, he was officially denaturalized, stripped of all his rights as a Portuguese citizen. His coat of arms was publicly destroyed, and his name was banished from the records of nobility forever. He died a stateless man in his own homeland. The last to be executed was a commoner, a servant named Antonio Álvares Ferreira, accused of firing the actual shots at the king. His execution was the most brutal of all. He was burned alive at the stake, and the crowd celebrated as the flames consumed him, symbolizing the purification of Portugal from the traitorous elements that supposedly infected the nation. After the executions, the bodies were burned, and their ashes were cast into the Tagus River. Salt was scattered over the execution ground to ensure that nothing could ever grow there again. The name Távora was officially outlawed. No one in Portugal could use that surname under penalty of imprisonment. The family's coats of arms were destroyed wherever they were found. Other members of the involved families suffered fates that were cruel, though less final. Hundreds were imprisoned without trial. The women of the families, including the king's mistress Teresa, were confined to convents for a life of perpetual penance, their social lives completely terminated. Pombal emerged from the massacre triumphant. King Joseph I, grateful for his protection, granted him the title of Count of Oeiras in 1759. A decade later, he would become the Marquis of Pombal, the name by which history knows him. The assassination attempt had become his ladder to absolute power. The sheer brutality of the executions shocked all of Europe. The French philosopher Voltaire wrote with horror about the refined cruelty used against the Portuguese nobility. Foreign diplomats reported back to their courts that Portugal had descended into a bloodthirsty despotism, rivaling the worst moments of the Inquisition. However, historical vengeance eventually came. When King Joseph I died in 1777, his daughter, Queen Maria I, ascended to the throne. The new queen had been deeply affected by the Távora massacre and held a total aversion to Pombal. She immediately stripped him of all his powers and exiled him from Lisbon. Queen Maria I ordered a tribunal to review the entire Távora case. In 1781, this court concluded that the original verdict was unjust, especially concerning the Távora marquises. There was no proof of their guilt or complicity in the attack on the king. The court restored the family's honors and their right to use their ancestral titles. The name Távora was officially rehabilitated. It was a posthumous vindication, but it came far too late for the victims of the massacre. Later investigations revealed that only the Duke of Aveiro had any genuine connection to the assassination plot. The Távoras were victims of a political conspiracy orchestrated by Pombal to eliminate his opposition. Today, more than 260 years later, the Távora massacre remains one of the darkest episodes in Portuguese history. It represents the moment that so-called enlightened despotism showed its cruelest face, sacrificing innocent lives on the altar of political power. The tragedy of the Távoras serves as an eternal reminder of the dangers of concentrated power and of a justice system twisted for political ends. When truth becomes a hostage to political convenience, even the noblest of families can find themselves on the scaffold, victims of conspiracies they never plotted.